Studioinhaf's 55th webinar. Before handing over to today's panelists, I'll take a few minutes to explain the context within which the webinars sit. INHAF's webinar series, Rethinking Cities, was conceptualized in June 2020. At the time, it was a response to the pandemic, the online mode of working for some, and a sense that people were in a reflective frame of mind. However, the larger goal of the webinar series was and is to open up a much needed societal dialogue on urbanization. Worldwide, by the year 2050, we are expecting 2/3 of the world's people to live in urban areas. But the nature of urbanization itself is complex. For instance, today, India is in fact one of the least urbanized countries in the global south. Yet in terms of absolute numbers, the 377 million people living in our cities and towns is staggering. The reasons for growth vary, some suggesting that growth within cities and extension of urban boundaries contribute more than migration today. But there exist vast statewide differences as well. Data suggests that, in fact, only 7 of India's 29 states and 7 union territories account for 62% of the urban growth. Regardless, by 2050, India's urban population is expected to be 877 million, an important milestone when, for the first time, the country will no longer be primarily rural. Urbanization, however, by itself is not a problem. Managing it adequately is. While the pandemic brought sharply into focus the challenges our cities and its people face, we did not need COVID to realize that India's urban systems are faltering. The webinar series is therefore in part a response to the challenge facing us all. It feeds into an initiative by INHAF known as Situary, Citizens Urban Initiative. This is a multi-level, multidisciplinary effort spearheaded by urban professionals, development thinkers, and practitioners to work on a blueprint that outlines the country's response to the urban challenge. It proposes to do 3 things: reassess India's urban challenge, rethink the Indian city, and reformulate the response in the context of national development challenges. With the accelerating pace of climate change, disasters, technology, and economic processes, the time for action is now and not in an unknown future anymore. But how do we handle urbanization so that we reap the benefits of cities as centers of economic growth and aspiration without the exploitative instincts and inequities that seem to be equally present? That is, in part, one of the many questions INHAF's webinar series hopes to open up for discussion. Till date, about 180 odd local and international organizations have partnered with INHAF to organize 55 webinars so far, and close to 250 odd urban professionals, youth, civil society organizations, and to some extent government agencies have shared their perspectives on multiple urban themes. This process itself enables us to map people and resources that strengthen the initiative and build a supporting constituency through working together and sharing for a wider ownership. Today's webinar, organized jointly with Community Design Agency, Social Design Collaborative, and the Center for Sustainable and Equitable Cities, brings together a small group of practitioners to discuss the civic agency of young professionals in the shaping of cities. It will also attempt to understand what we don't talk about when we talk about sustainability. For whom are we building the sustainable city, and who will be its builders? With this, I hand over to Jagan Shah, who will moderate today's session.
Thank you, Kia. Thank you very much for that scene setter, and also for creating the context for our conversation today. Thankfully, you have also spared me the task of actually explaining the larger urbanization context for our discussion today, because we're going to go into a fair amount of detail about local level issues. So thanks very much for that. Welcome everyone. We have 2 hours to spend with each other, and we are really looking forward to a lively conversation, not only with our 3 panelists, but also with the audience. I think this webinar is particularly interesting because it touches on themes which our esteemed and senior host, Mr. Shah himself, would know very well. He was, well, I was a student of architecture when I first read about the Ahmedabad Study Action Group, which Kirti had created when he was working with local communities in Ahmedabad. Very much, I guess, the kind of professional who had chosen a very different path to creating a practice that engaged with society. And in a sense, Kirti is one of the sort of guiding lights for many professionals who have then decided to follow alternative pathways for building their careers as architects, as urbanists. So thank you very much, Kirti Bhai, for giving us this opportunity to have this conversation. The subject today is a little cryptic for some of the audience, I imagine. Whose sustainability is a peculiarly worded topic. But essentially our aim is to, in a sense, put a question mark to the very idea of sustainability that has been doing the rounds, in a sense, especially since 2015, when the new urban agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted globally. So it's not a new subject per se. We are 6 years already into the implementation of the SDGs, and it's probably a good time for us to take a step back and take a look at what this sustainability really means for us, and perhaps reflect on the last decade or so of experience in Indian cities and cities worldwide as well. So essentially, we want to draw attention to the very idea of sustainability, which was defined in a very, very evocative way in 1987 by what is known as the Brundtland Commission, which said that sustainable development is the development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This is a fabulous way to put this, because sustainability is fundamentally a temporal relationship across generations of people who live in cities, but in the larger ecosphere as well. When we talk about future generations, what do we really mean? Are we talking about future generations as soothsayers, as futuristic thinkers, philosophers, and trying to project the future? Or should we engage with those who will experience that future? And therefore, we have today focused our attention on 3 practitioners who, in a sense, will in their own lifetimes probably see that future. And so for these architects and urbanists, what does sustainability play out as in their practices? What does it mean to them as they engage with local communities and dive into what ultimately is the real need of the hour, which is, to use a familiar phrase, localizing the SDGs. What does localizing the Sustainable Development Goals really mean? Is locality just a spatial idea? Is locality about age groups? Is it about issues? Is it about a zone of action, a space where sustainable development will get played out? Let's understand that better through our conversation today. And in a sense, discover what it means to have development from the ground up, what it means to actually develop narratives about the localness of development. So with that brief introduction, I want to actually now introduce our panelists today. It's a very interesting threesome of professionals, all of whom, at least I think we all are architects as our first degrees, and we have then branched out into other areas of specialization or practice. I'd like to start with Sonal Shah. Sonal is the Executive Director of the Center of Sustainable and Equitable Cities and the founder of the Urban Catalysts, advising multiple stakeholders on sustainable, equitable city planning and transport. Over the last 15 years, Sonal has worked across 10 states in India, as well as Asia, Middle East, and the United States, focusing on sustainable urban transport, non-motorized transport, integrated public transport, land use, and transport integration and gender equity. Sonal was responsible for introducing India's first gender-sensitive urban planning guidelines and actively contributed towards revising India's national urban street design guidelines with the collaboration with the Indian Road Congress, the IRC codes, to make them more people-oriented. She has led projects supported by numerous reputed donors and multilateral organizations and has taught at reputed institutions across India. Sonal graduated from the MSc Urban Planning program from Columbia University. She was featured in the Alumni Spotlight in fall of 2013-14 and in the Remarkable Women in Transport 2020 by the Transformative Urban Mobility Initiative. She was also part of Niti Aayog's UNDP supported program on innovative finance. Sonal, please say hello to the audience. Our second panelist is Swati Janu. Swati is an architect, artist, and writer whose practice focuses on housing rights and social justice, combining grassroots engagement and activism with policy advocacy. She is the founder of the interdisciplinary design practice called Social Design Collaborative, which was recently awarded the Beasley Design of the Year 2020 in architecture for building modular low-cost schools with farmers in Delhi. Bhawna Jaimini is an urban practitioner and writer based in Mumbai. Trained as an architect, she now works with the Community Design Agency on projects that seek to improve the built habitat of some of the most marginalized communities in urban areas of India using participatory tools. She is deeply passionate about gender rights and believes in using architecture and design to address inequities and inequalities in our built environment. Bhawna has written on urban issues in various national and international publications like Future Arc, The Tribune, The Wire, The Quint, and She the People. When not writing on urban issues, she often forays into culture, politics, and poetry. And I recommend that all of you Google Bhawna's writings and you will find a very rich set of ideas coming out of her writings. So with that, a set of introductions to the three panelists, I think let's get a move on. As you have noticed, all three of our panelists quite deliberately have very unconventional profiles, as I said in the beginning, and this is very deliberate. I want to start off by asking our panelists to think back to your education and training and share that one turning point when you felt or when you discovered that you wanted to put your education and training to a different use than your contemporaries. This could even have started in school, perhaps even before college, not necessarily through the professional education. So I'd like you to just reflect back on that and share your thoughts. When did you become an activist, or when did you become an urbanist that is seeking the kinds of goals that you are currently seeking? And I'd like to start with Bhawna. Bhawna, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jagan. Actually, I want to point out two incidences. Am I audible well? Just okay.
Yes, you are.
So one happened in my internship, and by that time I was already disillusioned by architecture. Like, I went through like an early life existential crisis in my second year when I was looking at Zaha Hadid drawings, and I'm just like, I don't understand this. I don't know, like, I don't understand these softwares. I don't understand these buildings. Did I make a mistake? Like what am I going to do in architecture? And then somehow I stumbled through, and then I landed up in my internship. I was interning with a really good architect. He has a good practice of commercial, sustainable. And by the time I was, already thinking about researching about sustainable architecture and this and that, alternative technologies, building with mud. So I was, it was already my fourth month of internship, and he sends me to this client meeting, and he's making this 6-bedroom courtyard house, a massive house in, I think, Scenic Farms or Pushpanjali Farm, somewhere in Delhi. And the client, I was there for like 1 hour 45 minutes, out of which like 70% of the client just spoke about his toilet. And he kept showing me images of really fancy toilets he had seen on his trips abroad. And I was like, oh my God, is this like, how am I going to live my life, like selling toilets to people? Like, no offense to people who do that. Like, I love a great toilet, but I don't know. I'm just like, in discourses, if I'm going to conferences, all these really fancy big architects, I keep talking about the role of architecture in society, and ultimately this is what I'm doing. I mean, I just did not see myself that, you know, I can sit across clients and just sell myself or sell my work like that. I'm just like, you know, there has to be something else to this degree, to architecture, because I loved the course. I loved what I was learning. I was just not able to see myself in practice and see the skills that were required. And then later in my final year, I was thinking about, you know, what should I pick up for my thesis, and I don't know how it happened, but Felon shouldn't happen that year, but Cyclone Felon had come, and I thought I met with this NGO who's working on relief work, and they were like, you know, and you know, she said this very profound thing to me, and I'm just like, you know, people are not talking about it. It's been 3 months, and she said, you know, unless somebody dies, India doesn't talk about disasters. So, you know, if you're poor, only when you're dead, you know, it engages a conversation. So I landed up in Odisha in my final year. I picked up a fishing community. I was there. I didn't know anybody in that state. I just, you know, from contacts to contacts to contacts, I landed up and I worked with, I didn't know their language. I didn't know, but people were so warm. People were so welcoming. They didn't have anything. And I'm like, wow. And, you know, I didn't feel like a savior. I didn't feel like, you know, I can, you know, I need to do something, or I have this degree, I'm going to change their lives. What it, what the thought that, that, the thought that was generated in me was that, you know, there is a balance. You know, I have so much, it's always on account of somebody else. And how, you know, it was the first, those thoughts of, you know, how you look at equity and equality was, you know, what that was that I started thinking about seriously was in my final year of college. So yeah, I think that's my origin story.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Bhawna. Thanks very much for sharing that. Let's move to Swati. Swati, over to you.
Hi. Yeah, I think my story is similar to Bhavna's, but it took much longer than she did, you know, to come to this realization. So I was very happy, you know, to want to be a Zaha Hadid for a few years. I think the first few years of my practice were what you would call mainstream. I was working in commercial architecture, again, with a very good architect, like with Bhavna as well. But a few years down the line, I started having what she called an existential crisis. I call it a quarter life crisis, assuming that I'm going to, you know, live to 100. And I just started questioning everything because after a few years of working, it just stopped making sense in some ways, because I think architects think a lot about what is outside the site, but always in terms of context. But we're not really thinking, you know, beyond architecture and even urban development, urban planning. We are not really thinking about what was there before, you know, we came in and started looking at it as a site. We're not really looking at it from an economic perspective, definitely not a social perspective. And I think through a few projects that I was working on, I started questioning this. And maybe I think also in your mid-20s, you sort of start questioning everything in any case, which is a very good thing. So I took a year off. I decided to, quote unquote, find myself. So I traveled a lot, you know, spoke to people from very different backgrounds. And I really started questioning the role of architecture as a profession and the relevance of architecture, especially considering that most of the people in our country don't have access to the services of a designer, to the services of an architect. Of course, you know, there are public buildings. But apart from that, if you think about how many people in our country actually, you know, work with an architect because you can afford the services of an architect, it's a very slim sort of a percentage, maybe 1 to 2% only. And so then what is the relevance of our profession if we can't reach out to people who might, you know, need those services much more? And in that, I also started questioning architecture and started thinking of it as inherently an elitist profession. Design is an elitist profession. And I mean, I think it was really to be able to find relevance for my own being and what I'm doing, that I started looking at organizations which were working in informal settlements. So I started working with microhome solutions. Jagan, you know, Marco and Raki, who have been my mentors. I worked with them for 6-7 years before starting my own practice. And informal settlements, which are self-built settlements across our cities, because most of our cities are built that way. They're built by the people themselves. So what then is the role of the architect, unless the architect can work with people, support them in this process of self-construction? So I took a shift in my career, and that was through the work that we started doing at MHS, which led to then the creation of my own practice, because I wanted to work much more hands-on, working directly at a grassroots level. And I think as I'm moving forward, I'm also shifting to policy a bit. But again, I think I'm jumping the gun. I can talk about that a bit later. But yeah, I think this sort of questioning myself in the middle, a few years down the line, and for which I think the seeds were already, sort of rooted during architectural education. Even though I think architectural education across the country doesn't really cover the issues that I'm talking about. We do have a few sort of exposures through our some electives, through our theory sort of classes. These things are touched on, but practically there's very little that we do when it comes to building directly with people on ground, using our own hands to build. So at least through these sort of immersions and exposures, I think the idea was somewhere seeded in the education. So there was the seminar that I took with Romy Khosla, who was talking about informality, which was the first time I thought about it. And suddenly you start seeing things differently. There was a lecture by Prem Chandavarkar, who was talking about how architecture is self-referential. We are just talking to each other. So I think these things over the years, you sort of like, they're churning in the background in your mind. And then you reach a point where all of it just needs to add up to make sense for yourself. So I guess, yeah, that's been my journey.
Thanks, Swati. That's wonderful. I'm sure that Prem and Romy are both, if they could hear this, they would be very, very proud and happy that they've had that impact on you. I think perhaps all of you can also think about really what the role of these sort of influencers and thought leaders has been. Like I mentioned, for instance, discovering Kirti's work when I was a student. Likewise, you've also talked about Romy and Prem having had impact on your thinking. Let's turn to Sonal. Sonal, share your thoughts. Where did the turn happen for you?
Yeah, thank you, Jagan, and thank you, INHAF, for having me here. I think I had a slightly unconventional architectural education. It was actually more of a liberal arts education. And if I have to reflect back on my career, I have barely practiced architecture. So, and I'll just share what happened with us when I entered my architecture college, in the first week, right? We had a group of 5 professors enter the classroom, and then they asked us to fill a form. What have you read? What kind of movies have you seen? I put my things along. I have come from an upper middle class, fairly conventional household. So then I put all the Bollywood films that I thought were cool at the time. And then they came back to us and they said that we've not read anything. We don't know anything, right? And this is when you're coming out of a fairly standard 12th standard science education. You haven't enjoyed this process at all. And then you're like, what is going on? And I think there was a destabilization that happened for me at that time. And then we started with reading Ways of Seeing by John Berger. And we started like that. And I think it's interesting because I would credit some of my arts faculty, Kaushik Mukhopadhyay, Chaitanya Subramaniam, and I think architects such as Prasad Chetty and Rupali Gupte, and also an art curator, Deepanjana. So a lot of my introduction at the time to both gender and urban space happened at that point. We did have courses on gender and urban space, but we definitely had courses on how women were represented in Western.
Sonal, can you hear us? Because your image just froze.
Oh, can you all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear Sonal just
yes.
fine. I think Jagan, you're frozen.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, there's a connectivity issue.
Yeah. Should I continue?
Please do.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
And so I think that's what happened with me. So my internship out of architecture was actually a street design project. There were different dynamics to that project. It was a beautification project with community participation, and we can unpack all of this later. But what happened is that right after that, I went on to do a research fellowship back at my institution on the impact of the slum rehabilitation policy, the Bombay model. So I was an architect who didn't know how to write, because you're not really taught how to write, but that was my entry into policy. And then was very fortunate to also get an opportunity to work with UDRI and Mr. Charles Correa on assessing the redevelopment of the milllands at the point. So very early on had exposure to urban and housing policy along with understanding gender. But the challenge I should outline at this point, Jagan, is that, you know, when I went on to do my master's, I was very clear it had to be urban planning. It had to be, I needed more exposure to gender studies, and I've taken a wide range of courses. So when I finished, you know, I finished my core courses in my school, and then I was all across the university. They didn't see me in my school. So I was, and when I started working with an organization that focused on transport, there was, you know, gender didn't find a space in practice, unfortunately. It found a space in my reading, it found a space, but, you know, I was looking, you know, in terms of where would be these areas where we could practice. And what happened, and it might sound pretty cliche, is that Nirbhaya's rape and death actually got transport organizations who were fairly conventional, and I must say that, to begin to understand gender and transport and mobility more closely. And I'm not saying that there was no activism before that. We definitely know that there were discussions about women's safety by numerous women's groups. But I think that perhaps these were largely confined to themselves. And so that became an opportunity for me, which I just then took up. And happy to talk about the journey after, but just wanted to kind of take this as a very key point in my practice.
Fantastic, Sonal. Thanks very much. I think it's interesting that all three of you essentially do refer back to real world exposure or experiences. I think Bhawna talked about Cyclone Phelan and the way in which that impacted her and her conversation with somebody who was working at the ground level. Swati talked about micro home solutions, which did some really remarkable and pioneering work in actually helping informal settlement dwellers to improve the structure of what they built and to make it actually structurally more sound, which was a very interesting entry point. And then you've talked about your internship and your your experience with working with Charles on the mill area, which interestingly, there is a new generation of architects that simply won't have any memory of the fact that there was a debate about whether Bombay should become a new Singapore or not, and so on. And then the Nirbhaya bringing up the issues of gender into a transportation kind of discourse, which wasn't paying attention enough to gender. So this is perfect. I mean, this is the kind of rich background that I was hoping that we would be able to touch upon. I want now to take a little bit of a pause and do a very quick round of what I call word associations, because I want then to lead into a discussion on basically the semantics of working with local communities. So let me start by giving you a few words, and I want you to literally off the cuff and very quickly give me the first words that come to your mind when I say these words. Okay, so just tell me what comes to your mind when I say the following words, and we'll do it in any order, but maybe we can just follow Bhawna, Swati, Sonal. Yeah. All right. So the first word is belonging. Bhawna? What comes to your mind first?
Mountains.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Far from the city.
Yes, far from the city. And the second word that comes to my mind is settlements without boundaries, without boundary walls.
Okay, okay.
So that's the image that comes to my mind: a settlement without boundary walls in the center of a mountain, in between mountains.
Okay, fantastic. Swati?
Yeah.
Belonging.
The first thing I thought about was teenage, belonging and teenage, because I don't know, I think it's the first time we actually think about where we are in society and our sort of relationship to wanting to belong to it or not. And I think many of us decide that we want to perhaps occupy the peripheries and have that sort of a relationship. And many of us decide that maybe we want to belong, we want to be a part. And I think even not being a part is a different kind of belonging. But I feel that we really think about it very acutely in our teenage. That's been my experience and so many others that I've spoken to.
Okay, fantastic. Sonal, belonging.
I think the first thing that comes to my mind is home. And
Home.
Home is belonging to me.
Okay, fantastic. I mean, I think a lot of us would agree with you. That's the first thing. But clearly Bhawna wants to go to the mountains. And no, this is interesting. I mean, I think Swati's point about teenage and, you know, the age in which we actually want to discover the belonging or not belonging, opting out. Very interesting set of associations. Okay, I'll come to my second word. Community. Bhawna.
The first word that comes to my mind is lack of. And, you know, it's something that I work a lot with communities, and community is a word that comes a lot in my practice. But when I reflect on it personally, I often ask myself, what is my community? Because I'm somebody who has lived in 4 or 5 different cities. And, you know, our parents' generation is rooted in their family is their community. And, you know, now we have, so, you know, it evokes a sense of uprootedness, because I can't really point out like what is my community.
Okay, fantastic. All right. Swati?
So community is my favorite word. And like Bhawna, I use it and overuse it, but I just can't help it. I really like that word. But I think, you know, very different from Bhavna's experience, I also associate safe with community. Like the moment I think about community, I also think about feeling safe. I feel like I belong. And also I think about collective action. You know, anything that we do is, you know, in collaboration, in collective action, and that sense of community is just immense. I can't tell you, like, that is my driving force. Anything that we do is because of the sense of community.
Okay, fantastic. Sonal?
Yeah. I think of contestations.
Contestation.
I think that I think the word community is so overused and of lately, and I think a lot of my work and my personal experience with different kinds of communities have driven different interests. So the first thing that I'm always trying to understand when people say community, what are you actually talking about? Which community? Who is this community? So, and what are the contestations between different kinds of communities as well? So
okay, interesting. All right. So contestation, and you're also, I think you made a really good statement that this is an overly used term, community. So perhaps this is the point of our discussion today, which is to go deeper into understanding really what that community really means.
Can I add one thing?
Please.
Just because, you know, all of us have said that it's so overused. In our office, we have like a board, and we have this, you know, dictionary of overused social design words, and community just like features up there. And it's ironic that because it's our name also, but you know, we should be able to make a joke on our.
We have a similar list, and agency comes second close. Community, agency. I think these are the words.
Community, agency, sustainability. These are my top.
Sustainability is old now. We don't use it.
Okay. Well, that's interesting, because then, you know, in a sense, this is the iterative process. Your practice is a way to discover community and discover sustainability every time, which is the point of our webinar. Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to come to the third word. I have 4 in all. So coming to the third one, responsibility.
The first responsibility I feel is it's something that in who I am rather than what I do. I think I feel more responsibility invokes a certain kind of practice in not just what I am doing, but what I'm being in, like, you know, in my life, like what I say, what I read, what I eat. And it's just like a new practice becomes. So, you know, so responsibility is to lead by an example, like, you know, just abide by your words.
Okay. Okay. Swati?
It's a bit corny, but I think the first word that comes to my mind is power, because with great power comes great responsibility, which is well, a line from Spider-Man. But also because I think it's so important. I think we all have a lot of power and privilege. We all come from privileged backgrounds, and I think that's just something that's been always really important to me, which is what can I do with this, and that becomes my responsibility.
Okay. Sonal, responsibility.
Yeah, I think I might actually agree with them. And the first thing that came to me was duties. What is my duty as a practitioner, and especially as someone who thinks and talks about sustainable transport? Do I walk the talk? So that is a question that I relate both responsibility, duty, and setting an example.
Okay, so you're also echoing what Bhawna said about lead by example, walk the talk. Fantastic. In that case, my fourth word will probably evoke mixed feelings. Government.
Patronizing.
Oh, please. Okay.
And the second word that I would like, because it's our favorite word, government, right now. So I would also give you a second word, would be like, sometimes when it's needed, it's absent, and when it's not needed, it's overly present.
Okay, that's a provocation. All right. Swati?
Yeah, I think my association would just be the word or the phrase mixed feelings, because I think the government is both. Government in a democracy is an entity that we all are electing. We are putting them there. But at the same time, the government also is an enforcer. And I think in the areas that we work in, the government is also often responsible for a lot of brutality in the form of violence, in the form of forced evictions of the communities that we work with, because they live in informal settlements, because they live in settlements which are considered illegal by the definitions of the government itself. So yeah, that's sort of a mixed bag.
Indeed, it is. We've just moved from mountains and settlements and so on, and home and belonging, to some pretty brutal kind of images. Sonal.
Yeah, I think because I think I have worked with government agencies, there are two things that I associate with them. One is silos. Right?
Silos. Okay.
Silos is, and that's something that I'm trying very hard with my work to address. How do we break silos, particularly when, and I think that government also often is seen as this one word for the state, but then there are so many actors within government that, that is another thing that I would just like to share. So, but the biggest thing I would say is silos that I associate with government and in the way that they work.
Okay, fantastic.
If I can quickly add, yeah, I think Sonal, that point is so important, because we often think of the government as a monolith. I mean, silos apart, but in general, government is made up of these different agencies, and some of them are actually facilitating fair processes, and some of them are sort of disrupting them. But yeah, we need to be mindful of that.
Okay, fantastic. I think this is a really rich set of images with which we can now enter the sort of the second part of our webinar. I think the kinds of word associations all of you have come up with, one, it highlights that, the point earlier made, which is that each one individually has an orientation to their practice and to the space and the context in which you work. But also that the larger community that you work with, whether it's the local community or the community of architects and urbanists or whoever, or for that matter with the government, each one might be bringing their own perspective on what a particular word or a concept might mean. And I just want you to dwell a little bit, any one of you can respond to this, about how this kind of semantics of establishing a common understanding with the people you work with your peer group, perhaps, with your own professional circles, plays out in your discovering your practice. How has this had an influence? Do any of you have any thoughts on this?
I can go first.
Sure, Bhawna.
Okay. I mean, it's a great point, Jagan, because it's something that I've struggled with in terms to understand, because I feel like the language of what we are taught, the language of architecture, urban planning, is very elitist. And it is not something that can be translated to, okay, let's find a Hindi word for it, or let's find a Marathi word for it. And when, for example, like how do you explain the concept of sustainability to people who are already living such frugal lives? How do you explain the concept of community? Like for us, and that's why I sort of talked about a lack of community, because as settlements and urban practitioners, we tend to define communities by a geographical boundary. So this, we're working in this colony in Govandi. It's an R&R colony. So, Sonal, you must be, because you're in Bombay, the Natvapare colony. Now, like, when we present, we say, oh, community of Natvapare colony. But actually, there are 25,000 people. Some of them don't see eye to eye. There are so many contestations, like, like Sonal already said. And how do you bring them together? And do we really need to bring them together? That's a question I keep asking myself. If I don't have a geographical community of my own, on what basis I am pushing these people to say, oh, you need to be united, you need to be. So is it a burden of their financial circumstances, their spatial circumstances, that they need to act as a community? So, all these words, just because I'm just dwelling on what you just said, that these are, I don't have answers, but this is something that I struggle with, I think about, and I feel like, how do we bridge that gap of of learning in a language which is, which takes a lot of things for granted. But when we sort of try to translate that into practice, you don't have those variables that were taken for granted when that course, or all these definitions and words were written. So
okay, so in a sense, you're recognizing that these definitions that you might be taught in college or as a professional have to be reinvented or questioned in the field.
definitely.
And certainly to bridge the communication with your local clients in the field. Swati, Sonal, any reflections on this sort of challenge?
Yeah, I'm happy to go next. I will bring in the Mavi Dili campaign now. I think this conversation that we're having on language and words is so important, and this is also what we have been talking about in our own team for the past few weeks. So let's take the word master plan. And I think it becomes so important to question it and also to deconstruct it, because who is this master who's sitting above us all, who's deciding for us? It sounds like it's a male. It's definitely a colonial and classist word, right? And so why is that? Why is a male, bigger than us figure deciding what's going to happen in the city for the next 20 years in the case of Delhi? Delhi is undergoing the master planning process right now. The master plan draft was released in June. For those who are in Delhi, you might know this already. And some of us for the last 3 years have been working as a part of the civic campaign, and Sonal is also part of it. The campaign is called Maybe Delhi. And it's made up of over 40 organizations and different researchers, individual researchers as well. And the goal is to make sure that this master plan, unlike the previous 3 master plans in Delhi, that this master plan doesn't leave people out who have been left out in the past. And these are communities such as people who are working as farmers, as home-based workers, as domestic workers, as street vendors. And so for that, right now, the feedback sort of platform that DDA has put up is online. And you can imagine how many people have access to this online platform. So if you go, today is the last day to file your suggestions and objections, 23rd. And if you go online, you can see how many people have registered, because only if you register can you file a suggestion or an objection. And you can see it's less than 5,000. And also you need to have an email ID to file any suggestion. So what the campaign has been working on is basically the gap that DDA wasn't able to fill. And the reason might be justified. The reason is that, because of COVID, it's not possible to do in-person sort of consultations or reach out to people. But, where there is a will, it is possible. And so over 40,000 objections have gone through the campaign, through the campaign's efforts across Delhi. And I think today the number would have crossed that, it might almost be reaching 50,000. And for that, a series of workshops have been held across the city to help people understand what is this master plan. Ask anyone in Delhi, what is a master plan? Very few people know. One of the responses that we got in these workshops was, "Didi, हमारे घर के बाहर जो चबूतरा है, master plan उसके बारे में बताता है." which I think is very smart because yes, you know, that is the detail of it and it captures its essence. But at the same time, how does a master plan affect you directly? आप जिस बस्ती में रह रहे हो वो मास्टर प्लान में है या नहीं, उसका फ्यूचर में क्या होगा, आपका जो काम है उसके बारे में मास्टर प्लान में क्या क्या प्रोविजंस हैं. Master plan is a spatial document. So, I mean, so when it comes to street vending, what are the spatial provisions for street vendings which affect street vendors directly? So these are conversations which are very important. And for this, we've also developed a toolkit to facilitate these workshops. And the toolkit is called Kaun Hai Master Kya Hai Plan, because this is exactly what we are questioning. And language becomes so important. And just boiling down the different constructs of the master plan into very simple, easy to understand concepts is so important. It's a very technocratic document, as you all know. There are some 500 pages. It took us a few weeks to go through it. So how does the person, a regular resident of Delhi, understand that? So for that, language becomes really important. When you're talking about housing, how do you explain concepts of shortage? How do you explain affordability? That becomes really important. And so one of the ways was, talking about DDA typologies, how the areas are linked to income groups. अगर आपकी महीने की तनख्वाह 25,000 तक है, तो आप EWS category में आते हैं. उसका मतलब क्या है? LIG category का मतलब क्या है? All the measurements then also need to be discussed in Gaj, because a square meter is not the sort of metric that people are using when it comes to regular conversations. Resettlement colony mein jao, you go to Safda Gevra, you go to any other resettlement colony in Delhi, 12 Gaj, 18 Gaj. These are the sort of terms which are used. And I think these are also terms which need to be at some level understood by our planners and our policy makers to be able to communicate the master plan. Because at the end of the day, the master plan, first of all, let's not call it a master plan. The city plan needs to be communicated to the people, and language becomes so important. And also what's happening through these workshops, which I think around 100 workshops have taken place over the last 2-3 months. People are also speaking the language of the plan now. They're saying, आप कह रहे हो कि ढलाव 10,000 लोगों के लिए एक ढलाव आपने मास्टर प्लान में दिया है, 2 ढलाव होने चाहिए. दिल्ली में आज के दिन 2,000 ढलाव हैं, वो कम नहीं होने चाहिए. अगर आप 10,000 लोगों के लिए एक ढलाव दोगे तो कम हो जाएंगे. होमलेस शेल्टर अगर आप बोल रहे हो इतनी संख्या के लिए इतना, तो वो कम है. अगर आप बोल रहे हो कि आंगनबाड़ी 10,000 लोगों के लिए एक होनी चाहिए, तो वो बहुत कम है, क्योंकि ICDS स्कीम में लिखा है 800 लोगों के लिए एक आंगनबाड़ी होनी चाहिए. And here language plays a very important role to facilitate these sort of conversations so that people can inform the plan. People need to be able to inform the plan. Anyways, I think I'll stop with this, otherwise I'll go
That's
on
fantastic.
and on.
That's fantastic, Swati. Thanks. In fact, the examples you just gave at the end also kind of reinforce one key point, which is that once you demystify, once that language is clarified, then people do find an immediate way to understand what is the intent. So the numbers matter, and they do have an understanding of the numbers. That's fascinating. That how many Anganwadis should be there per 800 people is something that they know, and they can equate that with what is actually being proposed in the master plan. That's really important. So the demystification leads to knowledge, leads to a discovery of what the technical plan is actually talking about. We'll stay with that, Swati. We'll come back to this. I want to move on to Sonal. And Sonal, reflections from your side. How has the very language of practice made a difference in your experience?
And Jagan, I think I'm going to build a little bit on what Swati said, and then the 2 words that I use, contestations and silos, right? Okay. And I think a big part, and how we also think of ourselves as a practice is, for us, research is practice. So we also think of research as practice, dialogue as practice. And because city making is essentially negotiations, right? Now, if that is the case, like I said, we're talking about contestation, silos, etc. What does that mean for us? And I'm going to again give examples. So back in 2015, like I said, because research is an integral part of what we do, I was trying to understand how could we move from a discussion on women's safety to gender equity in transport. And what I did is I took 2 groups, civil society organizations in Mumbai, Delhi, and Bangalore, women's groups who've been working on women's safety for decades, And then I spoke to government authorities, right? So bus transport operators, because that was my focus. And what I realized was simply this, is that there is such a wide gap between what decision makers understand what needs to be done and what civil society organizations are asking for. They are still grappling with what is safety, what do we need to do, and whereas civil society organizations are saying we want the right to the city and loiter. Like, there is no meeting ground, right? Like, and I think that this has been a big part of this kind of bridging that we also aim to do in two ways. So one of the things that we've done is when we're trying to also work with decision makers, we have also realized that even within civil society organizations, and I'm talking that we are beginning to grapple with mobility, right? Like, if you see groups, they know how to advocate for housing, for water, for health, for education. Mobility is new. It's also similarly with energy, right? These are the sectors that are emerging. And so a big part of our work, and we did, was one, we spoke about numbers, quantifying what does gender inequity in transport mean? And how does it impact women's daily lives? And one example that I gave is because we'd applied for a project with a research project with the UK Aid, where we actually calculated what we call the safety and the care tax that women bear, which results in reduced earnings when they work as e-rickshaw operators in Delhi. Right? And we partnered with the Self-Employed Women's Association because they had mobilized women e-rickshaw operators, right? And we used this knowledge, we partnered with SEWA in order to then make those policy recommendations to the government. And therefore, our convenings also have aimed to bridge this gap between the transport experts and membership-based organizations and civil society organizations are working on the ground, because there is no dialogue between these two groups, right? And I think that is one thing that we're really, really working towards. And I'll just give you one more example in the ways that we are practicing, is that, you know, the master plan discussion and the work that we're doing is happening. And the Delhi government recently announced the aggregator rules, right? And so what we did is, because we worked with the Self-Employed Women's Association, and we went through the different points of the aggregator rules because we wanted more women to be able to come on these platforms, right? Because there's no mention of gender. Gender doesn't get that attention at all. And so this is the process that we are working with, is how do you work and support organizations on a continuous basis in order to inform both policy and regulations as well. Hope that helps.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, I think with every passing question, we are actually adding so much richness to the conversation. But I want to now just bring us back to the sustainability question. Yeah. In fact, I mean, not that what we've said till now is not related. In fact, on the basis of all that we have just explored in the last close to 45 minutes, the fact that we have to demystify the language with which communities understand, I think very importantly, and perhaps this is a point we have perhaps missed, but it's important, is the individual. Because if somebody says the word community to me, I also immediately think individual, because the community and the individual are very often in a tension. And communities can actually be very, very, very dominating and domineering over individual choice. So I think this richness of sort of the meanings of things, the fact that each of you, even as practitioners, have a certain, what I would call a kind of a tacit bias, which comes from your positive associations with certain words and possibly your negative association with certain words, such as we saw with government, you know. So while Sonal, you look at it as silos, Swati looks at it as both a disruptor as well as a unifier or a facilitator, and Bhawna talked about how government tends to be patronizing. I mean, this is something we experience on a daily basis. So each of these concepts, if we have to unbundle, it's obviously a very complex operation, which makes you kind of think, what about sustainability? I mean, that, as I said in the beginning, the Brundtland Commission gave us a very simple but a profound description of what sustainability is. But really, this business of bridging between different generations, understanding what can be sustainable over a long period of time, this is complex. So I want each of you now to reflect a little bit. And let's come back to the key question that we had asked, which is, whose sustainability are we talking about? And what are those practices by which we can discover agency that can lead to sustainability? I'm sorry, this sounds a little kind of complicated, but I don't want it to be complicated. Whose sustainability are we talking about? And who's going to build that sustainability, right? And let's start with the reflections from any one of you. Bhawna, you haven't spoken for a while. You want to start?
Okay, I'll start. So one thing is that I feel now the Brundtland Commission definition needs to be retired. I think we definitely need a new definition. Yeah,
Okay.
One thing is because it is written from a developed perspective, because it takes the first assumption it makes is that communities have enough for their present needs. And the kind of setups, at least 3 of us working are here, forget about the future needs. These communities don't have enough right now. Who is going to talk about them? Who is asking them? And I feel like what sustainability doesn't, I mean, the discourses right now, which pains me, which makes me really angry, is that we're talking only about the bottom and we're not talking about taking from the top. So when let's say we talk about housing, like I've worked a lot on Rajiv Faz Yojana and PMAY right now. You go to town planning offices and they will look at, the first thing is there is not enough land. In Bombay, there is no enough land. Now, nobody wants to talk about that 1/5 of Bombay's land is under 5 private owners. Like, until and unless we take that land away, you're always going to have a shortage. In college, when housing is talked about, you'll give them like this. Everyone is coming up with like amazing designs. Every day I see one tiny house after the other. Somebody is turning an auto into a house. Somebody is turning in a shipment container into a house. Who is looking at land? I mean, we have to take back the land for our, the right to the city will only be realized when we start taking back from the rich, when we start taking back from people who already have. And until and unless that is, I mean, all these sustainability conversations, they're only like existing in these silos. I mean, all the communities I work with from when I was in Hunarshala in Bhuj, I mean, their carbon footprint should be negative. Like, although we shouldn't be using the word carbon footprint because it sort of puts we need to go after coke, we need to go after like these big industrialists. And, we're just looking at those, okay, Sarkar ne 5 hectares de diya hai, let's just, make these fancy, let's try to like give, I'm sorry, that's not going to happen. We want to make sustainable cities. Until unless we solve the land problem, and there is no sustainability, because you can keep talking about minimum, but we have to cap the maximum. I mean, to just give you an example, there's this amazing organization in Pune, and we were talking about slightly digressing from the land conversation, but how do we cap the maximum? And they have this amazing in the organization called Culprit, and they have this really good policy that the person who's paid the lowest and the person who has the highest pay, the ratio shouldn't be more than 1:4. I mean, that's a great example. Why can't we look at land at the same way? Like, people who have the least amount of land and the highest amount of land, how do we bridge that gap? So that's my 2 cents.
Well, that's a very provocative 2 cent. Some would call it extremely radical. The very notion of redistributing land. Well, the government of India has earlier experimented with having land ceiling, And then there was a repeal of the Land Ceiling Act as well. And it's an interesting subject because there not enough research has actually taken place. And perhaps a lot of the sort of local level research that needs to happen is on the Urban Land Ceiling Regulation Act and its repeal, and what was the impact at the local level. So I know at least for research, there's a really interesting subject that you've thrown up, but also just the provocation on the fact that we can't talk about sustainability till we basically understand whether even today's generation has what they need. So in a sense, there is an impetus on today's generation finding what they need for their own existence, let alone begin to talk about the future generations. So the idea that the Brundtland Commission's definition needs to be revisited, I think that's a very fair point, and perhaps these kinds of conversations might lead to us rethinking those definitions. Thanks for that, Bhawna. I want to move on to Sonal or Swati. Which one would like to go next?
I'm happy to go second again, if that's okay.
Sure,
with
Swati.
Sonal.
Sure.
So yeah, I agree with Bhawna on land is the most contested, commodity in our cities today, and it is possible. There is enough land to accommodate everyone. If the will is there, it is very much possible to have enough social housing, to have enough affordable housing in the city. But it's just who is that land allocated to? The priorities are, I think, self-evident. Coming to the question of sustainability, so typically sustainability rests on three pillars, as we all know, which is environmental, social, and economic. And my take is that there is a lot of focus when we talk about sustainability. There's a lot of focus on environmental sustainability, and that's something that we try and question again and again in our work. So again, taking the case of Delhi, most of my examples are from Delhi because I work in Delhi. I think it was 2 years ago when the Sarojini Nagar, the urban development project was coming up, the Sarojini Nagar projects, and there was a lot of uproar from the civil society, from citizens of Delhi for the felling of trees, some 16,000 trees. Similarly, now for Central Vista also, there is a lot of, I think, talk about the jamun trees, which are going to be cut down. And I think these are very important sort of protests which need to happen by our citizens. But at the same time, the question that I want to ask is what happens when people are being uprooted, right? Well, there is not at all that sort of uproar, or not at all that sort of a concern when it comes to the citizens of Delhi. Look at Khori right now, near the Khori village on the border of Haryana and Delhi. Some 10,000 houses are being evicted. Many of them have already been demolished, and that is in the name of environmentalism, right? Because they're saying that it's on forest land, but actually it's quarry land now. And there is so much more in the name of development, which has already allowed their hotels and a lot of other developments. But always it is the most marginalized populations who are removed in the name of environmentalism. And there is a word for this. The phrase for this is coined by Amitav Bhaviskar, we all know, is bourgeois environmentalism. So, when it comes to the air we breathe, when it comes to the quality of life for us, that we always raise our voice. And I think that is important as well. But at the same time, we also need to raise voice for people who are displaced by environmental projects. And we need to raise our voices in any case, if they are being displaced by other sort of development projects as well. And so we work very closely with the farmers along the river Yamuna in Delhi. And they are facing something very similar, when in the name of sustainability, but environmental, ecological sustainability, they are being evicted. So for the last decade, farmers have been evicted again and again because the plan, according to the DDA, according to Yamuna Riverfront Development Plan, is to build public parks. And now the latest master plan is also talking about River People Connect, where the idea is to look at the Yamuna as a blue-green asset to create jogging parks, cycling tracks. And I think all of these are important public spaces to be created, but do we need to remove farms to build parks? Can't we have both? And I think that's at the bottom of the work we do. And I think that's a very important question to ask, very similar to what Bhawna was saying. The carbon footprint of the farmers is zero. It's, almost maybe negative because it offsets all of our lifestyles, all the air conditioners and the refrigerators and the cars that we all have, is because we are hiding behind the poor, right? As Sunita Narayan has put it, India has a very low carbon footprint per capita because so many people are living in a sustainable way. that, those of us who are living in the cities and the 1% I was talking about who have access to architectural services, design services, are able to have a low carbon footprint per capita because of all the other people who are living sustainably. And I think these are very important questions to ask when we're talking about sustainability, because I feel that we're often only looking at half the picture. And this is the dialogue which gets missed out in our discussions. And I see a lot of questions are coming up, so I'll try and answer those, I think, in the comments.
I think we'll come to the questions later. Let's keep this tempo going, because I can see Sonal's been smiling through both yours and Bhavna's discussion. So Sonal, over to you. What are your thoughts of this?
Yeah, I think I align a lot with what Swati said in terms of, there is the way in which we think about sustainability is thinking about the environment, economic development, and social justice. And often, even in mobility, we are seeing very similar things, is that the focus on this drive around thinking only about the environment is in a sense pushing us not to think about equity, right? And I don't even know if you're thinking about the environment to that extent as well, because we're still trying to negotiate between whether we want increasing motorization, we think that is better on one hand, and whether we want to be environmentally sustainable. I just want to say one thing. That was one of the reasons why the not-for-profit organization that I have, we felt that because equity is so often missed in the discussions on sustainability, we decided to name our organization as the Center for Sustainable and Equitable Cities to re-emphasize that point as well. So I'm just going to stop here because I think it has been covered, and happy to take the conversation further as well.
Fantastic. Thanks for introducing the sustainable and equitable. And of course, Swati and Bhavna both have talked about it. Bhavna in a far more proactive way, take back from we need to go at interesting, that this becomes sort of the language of the conflictual and contested cities that we live in. And I think what comes out of all three of you and your presentation of this issue is that India needs a slightly different understanding from what might be the global sort of wisdom, quote unquote, on sustainability. And we need to look at the inequalities and inequities of the Indian city in particular, because it is a product of a history of very, very specific and very particular movements and events. I think, Swati, your introduction of Amita's use of bourgeois environmentalism, interesting. Also, Bhavna's, reminder to us that Kalpavriksh, which actually is one of the oldest organizations in the country that has championed the issue of the environment and sustainability. I think this is a rich body of ideas that we need to reflect on. We may not have time today to do that, but nevertheless, let's keep ourselves reminded of that. Okay, so I'm conscious of time, and we do need to give time for Q&A with the audience. Let's now come to agency. If given this situation, given this contested city, given the kind of inequalities and in some sense the blindness of the state towards those who perhaps are creating the sustainability of our cities, such as farmers or the informal sector, women as a working population within our cities. There are so many such instances. Given that blindness and given this very rich and contested local space, what about agency? Who can act? Who is able to and who needs to be the agents of creating sustainability in our cities? Again, drawing on your experience and your understanding, I hand it over to you three as, any one of you can respond to this. Talk about agency. Is the architect and the urbanist a necessary part of that agency? Do you need to be there as part of the process of demystification that Swati, you had talked about earlier? as part of the, perhaps even the provocation that Bhawna is talking about, what Sonal talked about between the government and different agencies of the government, even there isn't a kind of coherent dialogue. So where does agency lie, or where does it need to lie? Any one of you can respond.
I have a short answer for this.
Sure.
I think the more we have access to something, I think the more it is our responsibility, borrowing from your previous word association chapter, the more it is our responsibility to make sure everyone can have a similar kind of access. So I think definitely as architects and, quote unquote experts, I mean, that's a word often used for architects who are engaging with the planning process, which is not a term I like to use, but just putting it out there that that's how it is seen. So what can we do? I think that role is really important. And I think enough of bashing up the government as well. I think it's also on us to take initiative. It's also on us to maybe create the sort of proof of concept or pilots, that we hope that the government would start. But I feel that many of us have the resources and have the sort of know-how to implement these on our own. And I think there definitely we can play an important role. And I think everyone has been doing that, and I encourage the people in the audience as well to maybe think about that. If we think there is a problem and the government needs to do something about it, what can we do to sort of contribute to solving that problem? And I think that becomes really important. And sort of piloting things at our own scale. It can be in a neighborhood, need not be at a city level. If you can at a city level work together, find the kind of people who feel similar to what you feel and think, then definitely go ahead, mobilize people, get people together. And I think that is activism, which is mobilizing people to act. And that is using your agency, and then also perhaps being able to facilitate, help others be able to voice their opinion. And I think that's what agency is about to me.
Fantastic. Thanks, Swati. Sonal, Bhawna, either of you want to go next? Sonal?
Happy to go. Yeah, I think the question I might ask is agency for what? And to me, the big one is agency for negotiation. I think that to me that is one of the biggest, and I'll also share some examples, right? When we were asked by a public transport authority to do a training on road safety, right? From a gender perspective. So we went there, and then the first thing that we asked them when we went there is, how many of you all in this room use a bus? Okay, and nobody did, right? So they're a public transport operator who operates buses, but the depot managers and the regional depot managers don't use buses themselves as well. Okay, fair enough. I mean, and so one of the things that we have realized as far as thinking about sustainable modes of transport is that the people who are making the decisions around sustainable transport rarely use those modes of transport. Yeah, I think this just has to be put out there. And therefore, one of the big things that we try to do is personalize this. If I may borrow from the idea of the personal is the political, in the sense that how do you begin to understand what is it for you to be a pedestrian and walk on the streets as a pedestrian and not as an expert? Don't put on that hat, right? Because the moment you think about expert, then they begin to talk about traffic engineering and etc. And so one of the big things that we also do is, first is remove them from their conference rooms. I said, like, let's just step out. And one of the exercises that we did was actually, when we're talking about universal access, we made them sit on a wheelchair and said, can you access the bus stop outside your headquarters on this wheelchair? A lot of giggling, laughing, whatever, like they were like, oh God, what happened, etc. And I think this was, and then because of course they were the depot managers, etc., we said, why don't you come? Why don't we let a bus stop here and see if you're able to board the bus, right? And they weren't, because there was a mismatch between that access ramp of the bus and the level of, so if you are a person on a wheelchair, you cannot use that bus. And I think this is a small example to also illustrate what might be the ways in which we think about bridging, and what might be our role, if you will, in bridging this gap between those who make the decisions and for modes of transport they don't even use, right? So what does that actually mean? I'll give you another example. We also did a workshop with paratransit drivers, male paratransit drivers, female paratransit drivers, RTA, the Road Transport Authority, and the traffic police. And when we were doing this workshop, so this is interesting because again, this is multi-stakeholder, right? And we made all of them stand in a line, and we gave each one of them a character. One of them played the role of an elderly man. Another one played the role of a pregnant woman, so one of the women. And we gave them certain scenarios. I think we know this exercise, leave no one, I mean, I call it leave no one behind. And we gave them certain statements. If that statement was true for you, you took a step ahead. Otherwise, you stayed where you were. So statements like, I feel safe to walk out by myself in the night. How does a male caregiver differentiate from a female caregiver, right? And at the end of the exercise, we have this staggered line, right? And then we began to ask them to reflect on this. And it was interesting because we had this union leader, this paratransit union leader, who actually began to talk, because that no, there's no problem of safety in my rickshaw. That is not a, he actually kind of began to talk about how he saw the difference between where he was and where someone else was. So talking about relationality, if you will. So just kind of talking about what it means, if you will, to at least in the context of mobility, to think about acting and experiencing as well.
Thanks, Sonal. I think very rich examples and really make the point very forcefully. I'm going to turn to Bhawna, and then we'll sort of come back to some of the questions that have been asked as well. Bhawna?
Yeah, so I would actually I mean, my experiences are very similar to what Sonal said, but in housing sector, where, you know, most of housing policies, architects, everybody who is working on the drawing board, devising those policies, making those houses, would never actually live them. And my experience is not as happy as Sonal's, because when you tell them that, you know, when you ask them that question, that would you be able to live that house, there is a flat no, and said, because, you know, we can work hard to buy a better house. These guys are getting a house for free or a subsidized, so it's okay for them. So, you know, that is the level of apathy that, you know, we have to deal with on a daily basis. Now, coming to the point of agency, I would like to talk about decentralization. So I think we can create a sense of agency, not just for us as architects, experts, whatever you want to call them, but for the communities we work with, unless and until we develop or we work towards a decentralized governance systems. Right now, everything is so central, and it's not just a government thing. I'm not saying this to bash the government, or it is how our society is also structured. It is only now that, you know, the young people like us are coming out and living life. You know, we have a very patriarchal nature of family, which is now then, you know, adopted at a government place, because the same people, you know, you have a patriarch in the family taking all your decisions, and that's the same how the government behaves. Now, you know, I think it's up to us. That's why I want to bring in the example of 74th Amendment, which was passed in the 90s, and still cities haven't adopted it. It gives incredible powers to ward committees, to, you know, it gives them the financial power, the social powers to actually devise. Now, why should somebody like, you know, talking about, you know, the Bombay example, why should somebody sitting in Kolaba take decisions for somebody in Govandi or a Dharavi or a Kulla? Like, those people know their colonies. Give them the money, give them the expertise, and they will make those decisions for themselves. To just give you another example from you know, from the neighborhood that I'm working in, Govandi, where, you know, we're creating a library for the children. There's some 1,500, 2,000 children. A lot of them stopped going to school because of the pandemic. Now we've done design workshops with kids. We have like a set ready. It's been 7 months. We haven't been able to get an allotment paper. The building people who live in those buildings do not have agency to decide, whether there'll be an Anganwadi or an office or a library. They also come with us to the office and say, just give us the library. Now that room has, it's just, so I feel like until and unless we empower people on ground to make their own decisions, and not just as community. So I feel when we talk about community participation, we think of expert as different, the government is different, and a community separate. I'm also talking about having overlaps. There should expertise should come from the community. The governance can come from the communities as well, and community is community. So that's what I think of agency.
Fantastic. We've obviously provoked Dunu Roy to have a really lively chat. So if you do get a chance, do look at the points Dunu's been making. We'll try and discuss a couple of the points because those are really crucial for our discussion. I think we are now at a point where I think we should address some of the questions that have been coming from the audience. This has been an incredibly rich discussion of issues, and frankly, I just won't even attempt to kind of make a completely coherent narrative out of all the things we've talked about, but some things do stand out. I think, Bhawna, your point about self-help, what I would describe as self-help, or and what would be viewed by government as somewhat anarchic, as a system, which is let people do things, give them the resources, and let them do it themselves. This do-it-yourself urbanism has been talked about, and in fact, from at least the 1960s, has been a very, very well thought out approach to building the city, but clearly is not acceptable to what Dunu has just described as sort of the neoliberal approach, in which he includes the 74th Amendment, Bhawna, that you just mentioned. I think this questioning of these larger frameworks that we have been taking for granted, perhaps is part of why we are having this discussion today, and we won't be able to nail all the answers, but this is has been very rich. I think Sonal's point about the personal is the political. Bhawna, you're talking about, in a sense, the body politic, not just the expert, but the community, the individual. I think there's a kind of coalescing of ideas about agency as being collective. Swati's point about, it's not just about the government, it's about what you also as an individual, as a citizen, contribute to the whole process. This is a very interesting sort of cluster of ideas, which is, again, in a sense, challenging the notion that responsibility or agency needs to be assigned to a particular actor in the larger sort of, in the larger play of things. So it's very difficult to kind of work through this, but I can see the point that Dunu's making about even the 74th Amendment, in a sense, beginning to assign roles, and the assignation of roles and sustainability, as we've described it, perhaps doesn't work so well. It's because of that assignation of roles that you have the inequitable kind of distribution of access to land that, Bhawna, you described. So there's a lot here to discuss. We've touched upon the environmental impacts of our access to resources and our way of developing the city itself. And before that, of course, we've had a number of very rich explorations of sustainability as well as agency. So I'm going to kind of stop here. I don't think we can resolve all of these conversations today, but it's really thrown up a lot to think about. I think, interestingly for me, the not in your backyard, not in my backyard, the NIMBY attitude is also prevalent amongst urbanites in India, especially. Sustainability is somebody else's problem. It's not my problem, right? So like Swati has said, if I'm doing something wrong in my plot of land, that's okay, but the rest of society shouldn't. that kind of NIMBYism is also very active in the civic space. And I would just throw that in. I'm going to pause here. We are close to 7 p.m. We have another half an hour to go with this. And let's now engage with some question and answer. And I'm just going to look at the Q&A. Oops. Okay. There haven't been too many questions, and Swati seems to have answered the two that were raised.
I can take one question verbally if you like.
Yeah, please do, Swati. I think the first question from Dennis Rodwell is something that really needs to be shared with the audience.
Would you like to read the question out, Dennis's
question? No, Swati, go ahead. I think if you can give a précis of the question, that would be good.
Okay. Because what I liked about the question is he's asking about how here what we're doing is often just using European models, right? Which he's written, are repeated, copied, dating back to 19th century. And I think when we talk about sustainability, it's really important to also address this, which is our idea of development, right? And I think that lies at the heart of our approach to sustainability. So if I can just take a few minutes to share a quick story. This is from Odisha, Bhawna, where you have also worked. And I was doing some work there in North Odisha, in the Keonjhar district. And I was also learning about the traditional architecture of the Juan tribe. They are one of the PVTG, the potentially vulnerable tribal groups. And today they are facing a huge loss of their lands because of illegal mining, because of deforestation, because of building of power plants. And apart from this loss, what they're also facing is a loss of their culture because of the loss of their traditional architecture. And I think that stems from our policies and our idea of what we define development as. So in the villages, in the village life, in the community life of the community spaces, the most important is the Manda Ghar, which is the community center. And at the center of the Manda Ghar is a holy fire, the Dhuni, which is kept lit at all times, 24 hours, 7 days a week. And it's also where everyone comes together, to keep it running. So the teenage girls are responsible for the upkeep and the maintenance of the community center. The boys are responsible for getting firewood and to make sure that the fire is always lit. If there's a guest to the village, then the family takes the fire, takes the embers to the kitchen and then makes the meal for the guests from that. Now, what has started happening is that, so we all know about Indra Awas Yojana, which came about in the 80s, which supports construction of houses in rural areas. So what has happened is that the community centers now are slowly being demolished. And instead, concrete, community centers are being built. These are basically like cookie cutter concrete boxes. So if you are in Sikkim or if you are in, if you are in Kochi, it's the same sort of a concrete box, regardless of the climate or the geography of where you are. And so what is happening is, so these community centers are really beautiful. They're built in mud. They are built using traditional architecture, wattle and daub sort of technology. And of course, the youth, the younger people don't want to live, using that technology. How many of us would want to live in mud houses, honestly speaking? But at the same time, what it's also eroding is how people come together. So these community centers are where people come together, meetings happen. If you're just passing by, you stop, you have a chat. The traditional sort of drums called changu are sort of exhibited on the walls. So now in the concrete community centers, the fire cannot be lit because the roof is tin sheet. So it collects a lot of soot. So what people have started doing is they have shifted the fire out. In many cases, so it's just in the open. So like the whole community center has been deconstructed. In some cases, they have shifted the community center to a school or to an adjacent house. So now there's an old community center and a new community center. So there's a concrete one and there's a traditional architecture one. But when I was talking to people there, what I realized is they told me that they don't even hang out. They don't really hang out that often anymore, just because that space has been sort of moved or deconstructed. Just it stopped people from coming together. And I think it's so, in this small example, we can see the effect of the large scale at which our policy has worked. So Indra Awas Yojana now has been revised also through the Prime Minister Awas Yojana, the Gramin Prime Minister Awas Yojana. In Indra Awas Yojana, they said that pakka construction hoga. If it's pakka construction, then you can avail the scheme, right? And pakka is, guess what? Concrete. It basically boils down to concrete and mud, and even stone was called kacha till the PMAY now has sort of revised the definition of kacha and pakka. So which basically is saying is traditional architecture is kacha, it's seen as poor, it is seen as backward, and concrete, basically building in concrete, and the sort of indicators of consumption that we all have, that basically is a development. So the same trajectory that the global north has gone through, our colonizers have gone through, now the colonized nations, the global south also is going through, and we are subjecting the same narrative on the indigenous populations, and that defines our idea of sustainability. And I think that's so important to think about at the bigger picture. So I hope, Dennis, this has answered your question. And yeah, thank you for letting me share this story.
I'm not sure if Dennis is still there to respond, Swati, but thanks very much, actually. I think that example of Keonjhar is very apt. Clearly, the sustainability issue does require the appropriate design. And there again, I think it only highlights the importance of the professional, of the practitioner as well, to be part of this process, rather than, in a sense, to step back and say, well, this is not my problem. So it's really crucial that we do participate in this overall process. Bhawna, are you wanting to come in?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
please.
Just my previous organization, I was working with Hunashala Foundation for about 5 years before coming to Bombay. It's an organization and they do a lot of work in appropriate technology. And Swati, they similarly worked on revising IY. They got, we did the entire statewide study of what local technologies are, what traditional technologies are, and sort of work with the community to come up with also, because they were also not completely, cyclone safe, disaster proof, and then Hunashala worked with the government to get those cleared. So now the government of Gujarat has actually cleared a number of traditional technology. But that also brings me that yes, Jagan, I agree that there is a role of the profession here to sort of work with these processes. But what it also does is that until and unless there is an expertise stamp, until and unless there was an organization and number of architects who are willing to, let's say, legitimize those practices, they were not legitimized. So are we in turn also creating these power structures by being the expert in the, I'm just thinking out loud.
I think clearly what has come out from today's discussions, Bhawna, is that yes, we are very much complicit and participating in these processes, but have the choice. I think that's what each one of you has, in a sense, highlighted, that there is a choice.
Yes, and I think, because a lot of provocations and statements by Janu, I feel like what in turn at least the three of us and all here are doing, and we are negotiating with the system to, okay, itna nahi hota to itna kar lo. And I think what Janu is saying is why we are not talking about dismantling the system and reimagining a new system completely.
Well, I think that
it's
also brings up another question, which actually Dennis himself has also referred to, and that's whether what we are talking about works at all scales and at all levels. So I think the scaling of sustainability as we are talking about it, of agency as we are talking about it, is a crucial question here. You may talk about local agency and the community at the local level, but how does all of that aggregate to a larger sort of quote unquote social choice, right? How can it be aggregated? And what are those processes? Are sort of electoral democracy processes sufficient for that? Are there other mechanisms that need to be deployed? I want to do justice to the two questions that have been posted, and Swati, you have answered both. Thank you. But in case Sonal or Bhawna wants to respond to the second question from Manish Thakre, Manish has asked, how do we bring in children, under 18 years of age, and their voices into the city planning and governance? What would the panelists suggest? I suppose the overall question is about the education system itself, but any quick thoughts, Sonal, Bhawna, on children and how they can be part of this?
Actually, we are working a lot with children in both the communities. Both are major projects. One is in Ahmednagar, where we're working on redeveloping in situ slum housing for under the PMAY Awas Yojana, and other is looking at how do we make the built environment of these horribly built SRA colonies. And one thing that what we've done is, like I mentioned earlier, was though we say it's a community, it's 25,000 people. Like, how do we try to break down community? So we've started working with children, trying to, show them plans, and not just children, but, a lot of work we've done with teenagers. So for example, we did this workshop with them on, and these are Muslim children, and they don't go, especially girls, they leave schooling very early. They don't have, there's a lot of fear because the community, Govandi is actually called as a ghetto because of its very high density and high crime rate. So there's a lot of, a sense of safety. And, every time we would go into the community and everybody like, oh, our parents say it's not safe, it's not safe. So we got these teenagers down, and we, showed them the map. It's the first time they were looking at, the map. And that is when they realized that, their colony is actually a stamp with like such little space in their buildings. And so we gave them, we divided the group into girls and boys, and we told them, you gave them these bindis and say, we first went on a round with them because a lot of them hadn't even seen their spaces. And they say, you put like these bindis in 3 different colors where you feel really safe, and where you self like, okay, slightly safe, and where you feel like completely unsafe. And what emerged was that where the girls felt completely unsafe was where these teenagers felt really safe. And that sort of became like a talking point between how they were looking at the other gender. Why was it so? As an organization, as an organization working on ground with the community, we are very cognizant of the fact that community is not one thing, and sometimes some people who are more verbal and talkative tend to hog light. And sometimes you see a lot of, I've seen this with a lot of NGOs, because I've worked with women's NGOs, craft based NGOs in my practice, is that usually they say we work with the community, but they will only be working with those 2-3 houses or 2-3 people. So, yes, to recognize, yes, children, and you don't need voting rights to be recognized as city citizens.
Okay, thanks. Sonal, any thoughts from you on this?
Yeah, Jagan, I might answer the previous question very briefly.
Sure.
That, whether electoral democracies are sufficient, and we know they aren't. And I thought that the Baby Dilli campaign was one model that could be a demonstration of how you have sustained advocacy over a period of time to ensure accountability, right? And to ensure that the city planning, at least at this point, the planning process, because implementation is another ball game altogether, that the city planning process does hear voices from the ground. So just want to kind of give one example of that. We've done some work with adolescents, and I can kind of share again some, the workshop that I spoke about on leaving no one behind was actually focused on the youth, and how could mobility in a city like Rohtak. So we were brought on as advisors to design this workshop as well, become better for the youth. And when we involved the youth along with other stakeholders, there was a point when one of them, she came to me and she said, Sonal, I want to go and talk to the traffic police about some, like we've had this issue. So this is what I told her, this was at lunch. She went at lunch, sat on the same table as he did, and I did not go. So I deliberately stayed out because I felt that me being present at this point would not allow this interaction between these two stakeholders, right? So my point is, again, saying nurturing the power of the youth, and again, exposing them to different stakeholders. We've also done it in a studio, if you will, in an architecture studio, where we, this was as part of Kamla Reja, where we made a plan to improve one of the wards. It was called the K West Ward Improvement Plan. The plan was made by students, so 18 years to about, I think this was maybe the 4th year, so about 20 years. They interacted with the elected corporator, and then they spoke about what the plan could do, right? So I feel like there can be interesting ways of how you can have youth participate in city planning and governance as well.
So we're getting closer and closer to the end of our webinar, but now that Manish has popped this question to us and we have addressed the issue of children and the youth, let me double back on what I said in the beginning, which is we had described agency as possibly about the generation that's going to be most affected in the future, having a sense of agency in defining how development should take place today. The question I want to ask the three of you is, do you feel in your experiences of working with the youth, adolescents, children, women, stakeholders at the local level, do you feel that communities have the capacity to begin to define how development should take place in an unmediated way? Not because professionals are, in a sense, because this perception is a very problematic perception. Very often it is held against the activist professional, that you are instigating a certain point of view. Are we at a stage that communities can raise the bar and raise the level of discourse on what they want from the future of their city? And if not, what should we do about it? Let's go through each one of you in sequence. Let's start with Sonal. Sonal, yeah.
Yeah. Me, and I kind of answer this in the way that we have approached our work, is I do think at this point, as far as if I focus specifically on gender and mobility, thinking about gender and mobility, there's a big capacity gap in the system. And this is not only government, but also I would say that by government, I mean not only transport, but even your WCDs, who have often been the champion, right? Women and child development departments, who have been the champion for women's rights. There's a capacity gap there as well, right? By capacity meaning still not kind of taken to understanding the impact of mobility on women's lives. And here we've not even addressed gender minorities, right? So we've only focused on women. So that the third piece is, like I've also mentioned, is with membership-based organizations and women's groups as well. So let me give you an example that when we did this project on understanding the impact of COVID-19 on women informal workers' mobility, we had followed a process where we spoke with women's groups, membership-based organizations, transport experts, government. So all three stakeholders at the beginning of our research shared the findings with all of them. And then when we convened a third workshop with the same groups, we actually had a union leader from Chennai. She said that, this is the first time that I'm being exposed. I understand intuitively what their members are going through. It's a membership-based organization, domestic workers, street vendors, etc., for women workers union in Chennai. She said that, have there been studies on women and mobility, right? And so I think at this point, we are at the point where there is more awareness. But I do feel that there is a need to work in a concerted effort with organizations. And we do that primarily at the middle manager and leadership levels, because we know that they are that tier that works, that moves, that advocates. So I do think there is a need for, quote unquote, the technical experts. I'm not to be part of this process as well. So yeah.
Thanks, Sonal. Swati, you next. Maybe just a minute or two on this.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I'll just go back to the question that I'd started with, which is who is the master? And I think here the answer is at two levels. First of all, does the master listen? So here, community consultations are so important. If you are talking to people with disabilities, if you are talking to children through organizations that work with them, if you are talking to women-based organizations, then you definitely will have a sort of a plan which will work for all, which includes all. And secondly is, who is this master? That needs to change, right? So there needs to be a diverse, there needs to be representation at the planning level. You look at who is sitting in DDA, who is sitting, I mean, who are the people who have designed all our cities so far? It's mostly men who have designed all our cities. And now women, yes, are entering the planning organizations. More and more women are entering, but unless you have equal representation, how can you have, an inclusive sort of city? How can you have an inclusive public space which is occupied equally by all genders? If you don't have transgender people in your, planning committee, then how will you be able to understand what needs to go in? Yes, through consultations, but also representation, diversity at the planning level is also important. In our architectural fraternity, I raised this question as well. I mean, most of us who are sitting in these panel discussions are from, so-called upper caste. We are from privileged background. I mean, how many Dalit designers, how many Dalit architects do we really know of who make it to panels, whose work is published? So unless these things are changed, our cities are not going to change. The experience of our cities is not going to change. The sort of discrimination that we are talking about on ground plays out in the positions of power, the spaces of power that we occupy. And unless that changes, not much is going to change on ground. So at two levels, who's making the plan and are they really listening? I think these are the two things to think about.
Thank you. Thank you, Swati. Bhavna, a minute.
Yeah,
I can only give you a minute.
Yes, I just want to build on what Swati just said, because I totally believe in, and I'm going to give you a quick example of, this Dalit youth that we work in on our Ahmed Nagar project. And we call them the community representatives. They're in their late teens or early 20s, all from the community, and they work, as a bridge between, what the technical group is doing and on what their community is doing. So when the pandemic happened, like the first wave hit, we lost all contact. We couldn't go up, and these are all daily wagers, construction workers, and they lost all work. Now this group of 6 young people who were just from that community, and from with all their marginalized identity baggage, they rose up and they ran a 4 months long feeding program. They contacted different organizations. They just set up like this beautiful program, and when I heard about it, I'm just like, oh my god, like they don't need architects. If these early teen people can set up such a sophisticated program to rise up to the needs of their community, what are we doing building their homes? And that is one thing that I feel I've learned in my practice, that the role of the traditional architect is very redundant. We have created these traps to keep us relevant, because we will create a complicated policy and then we need an expert to put it down. But I feel if a system is, the democratic system is a setup where voices are heard, we would not need experts.
Or at least the experts can be more of sort of the barefoot architect, or the one that
facilitators,
is,
I think.
or facilitators.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. And I will just only say one thing. I think that gender representation only is not the criteria, because you can have women who are very patriarchal as well. So
yes, definitely.
Yeah, amongst all of them,
Indeed. Just for full disclosure.
Yeah. Just
absolutely. So okay, so this has been just fabulous. We are coming to the end of the webinar, and I want to give Kirtibhai some time to also share his reflections. But just to kind of try and sum up, what a sweep we have made from, we started with Bhawna talking about a client that wants a toilet designed. And it's just fascinating where we have actually landed up after, about an hour and a half, of conversation. But we just want to recall that in the beginning, we talked about, the need for access to the architect. And of course, we've just kind of challenged that notion as well, which is perfect. But one very important thing was that all of you spoke at some fundamental level about the opportunity that your own curriculum and your own institution gave you to discover this alternative practice. I think that's very important. You talked about some influencers that you had the opportunity to interact with, some experiences that gave you the opportunity to discover new practices. And I think let's stay with that, because that's important. And of course, important books as well. And Sonal, you mentioned John Berger's Ways of Seeing, which for me is also a bit of a Bible. So totally understand how important, some writings themselves can be. We talked about language and just the language of discourse and the language of talking about sustainability, how that matters. And I think, I like Bhavna's description of settlements without boundaries, because in some sense that's so fundamental to our acceptance of a divided city today, that we've lost the imagination of what it means for a settlement not to have boundaries. So, just want to recall that. But there were other very key words that came in: collective action, that was talked about; contestation. Sonal, you talked about contestation, and I think that is something that in a sense forms the basis of the civic dialogue, is to recognize contestation as being in some sense inherent to democracy. What we are as people, making the personal political, what am I, what is my position in this larger power structure, is very important. The sense of duty, Sonal, again, you mentioned about duty, and I think that's crucial. The mixed feelings we have about government. And I think those mixed feelings, we need to work on those mixed feelings, right? Because this is linked to that question of scale, right? I mean, at some fundamental level, you need a social contract that can scale from the local communities that we work with up to a system, quote unquote. And can that system actually retain the vitality of the local community conversations we've been having? And one of the things that stops us from doing that is the silos into which government is constantly divided. Sonal, you reminded us of those silos. But those silos can be bridged. So we talked about bridging. We talked about bridging between community and individual, between professional and community, bridging between government and the players on ground, very importantly. And also, I think, I shouldn't forget to mention just the richness of experiences that you all brought into this conversation. So I can't recall every example you gave, but you gave us so many examples to think about. I think the very challenging notion of redistribution is currently very appropriate. I think, Bhavna, you brought up that idea. I'm using redistribution as a very polite way to describe what you described. You were describing something far more radical, but the very idea that the commons, or the idea that public land needs to be thought about, who has access to how much land, is an important question that our society needs to think about. And that very basic kind of question that Swati asked, I like very much. Farms and parks. We need to have that debate. Is environmentalism really about using the opportunity to evict those who, in a sense, contribute to our city's economy? So in some senses, what Sonal described, the social justice plus environment plus development kind of framing of issues. Clearly, I think in closing, I can say that all of those experiences you're talking about, we need to kind of multiply it by 1 million or 2 million or something, so 1 million flowers need to bloom. And how do we make that happen is something that we shall leave for another conversation. And I'm going to just pause there. And I'd like to thank the three panelists for this very lively discussion. We pulled it off without any slides. So that's really commendable, I have to say. That's quite a change. And thank you very much for sharing and, in a sense, painting the pictures for us without having to use slides, which is really wonderful. And thank you very much to INHAF and Kirti Shah for giving us this opportunity to have this conversation. But I want to also have a few minutes with Kirti Bhai for his reflections. Kirti Bhai, over to you before we close.
What is time like, Jagan?
We have about 7 minutes till 7:30. Now 6 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. No, but we can probably go for a few more minutes.
Sure.
So I essentially wanted to, first, thank you very much, remarkable. I'll come back when I thank you in terms of what I think, but I think there are just few ideas that I wanted to kind of share, especially because all of them are architects and from architectural language. I wanted to kind of come back and talk about slightly wider definition of client. And I said that if you really want to be a good architect, you don't have one client, you have 6 clients minimum. One is the paying client who hires you. Second is the end user client, which uses this. A builder is the paying client, and the occupier is the end user client. Site as a client, neighborhood as a client, environment as a client, and city as a client. And the moment you put the 6 clients together, the whole concept of responsibility, the concept of whom are you dealing with, concept of whom are you serving becomes much more clearer. We, as a matter of fact, just given to looking at just one client, the paying client. And therefore we are so unprofessional in our professional work. This is one thing. Second thing that I wanted to share was the whole concept of sustainability and city. And wanted to kind of put city in the context of sustainability in not very well defined but understandable slices. One is the city as a residence, city as a dormitory, city as a place for living, and city as a place for working. And therefore, emphasis on housing, infrastructure, shops, malls, municipal services, transport, recreation, environment, pollution, whatever. This is one slide, city as residence. Second is city as economy. And I'm talking just in the context of sustainability. City as economy, that's the one which produces growth, which is responsible for our famous GDP, which is $5 trillion economy, place for globalization, and of course, the place for market. So, and you could extend this as far as you want to, but city as economy. Third is city as a people. And therefore, men and women, poor and rich, transgender, children, young, disabled, what have you. And therefore, the whole thing about equity, dignity, citizenship, right, law, whatever. So the third slice. Fourth, city as organism, metabolism. One which occupies just 2% of the land mass globally and consumes 75% of the resources and throws 75% of the waste in environment, and you could describe as long as you want to. And the fifth, city as image, and that is Mumbai as Shanghai, Chennai as Singapore, and the new capital that Andhra Pradesh was building as something else. Now, and of course, when you look at the city as organism, you're talking about city as a guzzler of resources. And this obviously have many overlaps. But it's very clear in the context of sustainability that city as people is forgotten, is overlooked, is very much behind. It's not a priority. And therefore, housing is FSI. Housing is profit. Land as commodity. Land as economic good. Land, though a natural resource, is not a social good. An investment not for welfare is for private good, not for public good. So if you really kind of put all this together in the sustainability context, and if you put it in the context of what you're saying, discovering civic agencies for the future Indian city, I don't think it's one. In my mind, it's 5. City agency in the context of institution and institutions, agency in terms of physical space, agency in the context of a concept, agency in the context of morality, agency in the context of value system. And therefore, you got to carve. And I'm not elaborating on this. There's not much time, but I thought I'll put this across in the context of how does one. And therefore, the major challenge in the context of sustainability is to recapture city for the people and humanization of development. City cannot be real estate in the context of sustainability. Another thing that we've got to talk about, and I think this is something which just cannot be forgotten, and I like to remind just whenever sustainability comes in the picture, is this famous Canton Declaration that civil society had put together 15 years ago. It was part of it. And this 8 principles, I think, are very important in the context of sustainable city. Of course, the alternative development model, but politically participatory city, economically productive city, culturally vibrant city, environmentally sustainable city, socially just city, ecologically sensitive city, technologically adaptive and accommodative city, and of course, people-centric and compassionate city. So in the context of sustainability, just one more thing that I wanted to add is this, that because cities are about growth, and cities are produced by growth, we all the time talk about growth in the quantitative terms. It's very important to look at growth in the qualitative terms. And if you start looking at growth in qualitative terms, your understanding of sustainability will change. And my last little point is a small little story that I like to tell. But so dramatic that story is. This was 2 years ago. I was supposed to go to Delhi, and it was 46 in Delhi and 46 in Ahmedabad. And someone told me that, why did you choose that day to go? I left 5 o'clock in the morning home and came back 11 o'clock at night. So it's about 16 hours. And the person who asked, he said, why do you take so much hit? I said, 16 hours that I was out. Actual 46 degree was of 4 minutes. Starting from home, where I started at 5, sat in the car to go to the airport, to the flight. Those 4 minutes that I'm talking about was a distance, time, where I got down from the car, went to the Ministry of Agriculture, those 2 minutes, and coming back and getting into the car. And what is interesting is this: the entire development game is to reduce their 4 minutes to 2 minutes. And I think it really kind of talks about, or Bhawna and everyone talks about, what a privilege it is. And if you really can't, and I think privileges are privileges everywhere, but privileges in India are very special. And the entire battle, the entire development, entire investment, entire developmental effort is geared towards reducing that particular gap. And unless we look at that, we are not going to understand sustainability. We're not going to understand our cities. We're not going to understand our development. So those are the kind of few things which I very much wanted to put across. And to come to my final, as an organizer, as INHAF and 55th webinar. So thank you very much, Jagan, for your initiative. We have been talking about this for 12 months, when webinar series was only 10 webinars. I had approached you to organize webinar. It took us about 12 months, but it was wonderful for initiative, putting this wonderful panel together, and very creative conduct of this webinar. It's one of the rarely and very well conducted webinars. So thank you very much. I, of course, much thank this very young panel. And thank you, Bhawna. Thank you, Sonal ji. Thank you, Swati. It's wonderful to listen to you and understand where you are, where you stand, and I think where and how you're inspiring younger people to come in. I must also thank my colleague Kia for a very interesting introduction to the whole webinar series. There's a purpose why we are doing this mad thing, and there's a design, and we hope to achieve something, not going anywhere at this point of time, but is still trying very hard. And of course, I must thank my colleague Shah, behind the scene, who makes this possible, works very hard, and looks after logistics. So thank you very much, Jagan Bhai.
Thank you.
And thank you, panelists. Thank you all wonderful people who are staying back to listen to this very interesting conversation. And we'll learn a lot. It was worth waiting for, Jagan. Thank you very much.
It took me 12 months to find this panel, Kirti, you can imagine. Thank you very much, Kirti Bhai, and thank you, Ankisha, for putting together this session for us, and Kia for the introduction, and of course, my panelists for being part of this. Thank you, everyone, and the audience who has stayed with us till the end. Thank you.